It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon at Harmony Park. The sun bathed the sprawling lawns in golden light, children squealed with joy on the playground, and joggers passed by on the winding paths. A group of teens played frisbee on the open field while parents chatted over picnic blankets. Under the shade of a large oak tree, Malcolm Hayes, a tall black man in his mid-40s, sat on a wooden bench. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he exuded a quiet presence, sipping from a travel mug and reading a thick book. Beside him was his leather badge holder clipped to his pocket, catching the occasional glint of sunlight. Across the park, Margaret Bennett, a woman in her late 30s, scanned the park with a sharp gaze, taking in the bustling scene. Her eyes landed on Malcolm, who was absorbed in his book. Margaret frowned. "What's he doing just sitting there?" she muttered to herself. "No kids, no family. Just watching." Her unease grew as she kept glancing at him. The dog tugged at its leash, eager to explore, but Margaret remained fixed on Malcolm. "This doesn't feel right," she said aloud, though no one was around to hear. "He's probably scoping things out." She thought this was a provocation, something that had no place. In her beloved community, unable to contain her growing frustration, she decided to take action as she approached Malcolm, her voice filled with an accusatory edge, and demanded that he leave the park. When Malcolm remained composed and unbothered by her outburst, Margaret's irritation only grew. Determined to escalate, she pulled out her phone, intent on calling the police. "What happens next will leave you speechless." Before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have you ever witnessed a situation like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Margaret, her grip on the leash tightening, approached Malcolm with determined steps. Her dog barked softly as they neared the bench. Malcolm glanced up briefly, noticing her approach but returning to his book. "Excuse me," Margaret said, stopping a few feet away. Her voice was firm but edged with irritation. Malcolm looked up again, his expression neutral. "Yes? What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You've been sitting here for hours, and people are starting to feel uncomfortable." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, setting his book down on the bench. "I didn't realize sitting on a public bench was a problem," he said calmly. "I'm just reading," Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. "Don't play dumb with me. You're sitting here alone, watching everyone. It's suspicious." Malcolm sighed, leaning back slightly. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm not bothering anyone. Just enjoying the day." "That's what they all say," Margaret shot back. "This park is for families and residents, not for loitering." Margaret's voice grew louder, cutting through the hum of park activity and drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. A jogger slowed down mid-stride, his brow furrowed as he glanced toward the confrontation. A family enjoying a picnic blanket not far from the bench exchanged glances, the father murmuring something to his wife as their two kids continued playing with a soccer ball nearby. "I'm not loitering," Malcolm replied evenly, his deep, calm voice carrying just enough to reach those nearby. "I live 5 minutes from here. Is there something specific you think I've done wrong?" His words were measured, his posture relaxed but firm, as if he had been through this kind of exchange more times than he cared to count. Margaret huffed dramatically, placing a hand on her hip. "You've done plenty wrong by sitting here and making everyone uncomfortable," she snapped. Her tone suggested an air of righteousness, a belief that she was standing up for the greater good. Her dog barked once as if echoing her agitation, though it quickly settled back down at her feet. A young couple sitting on a nearby bench exchanged a glance. The man leaned toward his partner, whispering just loud enough to be heard by those closest. "What's her problem?" "The guy's just sitting there." The woman beside him nodded, her eyes darting back to Malcolm and Margaret as she subtly raised her phone, angling it to capture the growing tension. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her finger hovering over the record button before she pressed it. Margaret, oblivious to the attention she was garnering, pressed on. "It's people like you who ruin the sense of safety in places like this," she said, her voice rising another notch. She waved an arm toward the playground, where children climbed jungle gyms and zipped down slides. "These families, these children, they don't need to deal with someone lurking around making them nervous." Malcolm exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Ma'am, I've been sitting here, minding my business and reading a book. You've been standing here accusing me of things I haven't done. If you feel unsafe, that's something you should reflect on, not project onto me." His words were calm, but carried an undertone of exhaustion. This wasn't new to him. This wasn't new to any black man who had learned to navigate spaces where his presence was constantly questioned. But Margaret wasn't listening. She took a step closer, her dog tugging at its leash as if sensing her growing tension. "Reflect on it," she spat, her voice dripping with disbelief. "I'm reflecting just fine, and I see a man who's out of place. And when someone looks out of place, that's a problem." A group of teens tossing a frisbee nearby paused, their playful shouts quieting as they turned toward the commotion. One of them, a boy in a red hoodie, nudged his friend. "Dude, she's flipping out for no reason," he said, pulling out his phone. "This is gonna go viral for sure." Margaret still didn't notice the growing number of eyes on her. Her focus was solely on Malcolm, who, despite the situation, maintained an air of quiet dignity. "You know what?" she said, yanking her phone from her pocket with a dramatic flourish, holding it up like a badge of authority. "Let's just see what the police think about you hanging around here." Malcolm shifted slightly on the bench, leaning back and crossing his arms. His patience, though vast, was visibly wearing thin. "If you feel the need to call them," he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness, "go ahead." "I'm not going anywhere." Margaret turned on her heel, dialing 911 with exaggerated urgency. Her words were loud and deliberate, ensuring that anyone within earshot could hear the gravity she injected into her tone. "Yes, I'm at Harmony Park," she began, her voice full of conviction, "and there's a suspicious man loitering near the playground. He's refusing to leave, and, well, he's watching the kids. It's very unsettling." Malcolm let out a slow, deliberate sigh, glancing upward as if searching for patience in the rustling leaves above. Around him, the quiet murmur of the park shifted. Conversations paused. Picnic-goers turned their heads. The young woman who had started recording earlier whispered to her partner, "She's really doing this." The man nodded, his expression incredulous. "And he's just sitting there. Unreal." Margaret ended her call with a sharp tap on the screen and spun back toward Malcolm, her expression triumphant. "The police are on their way," she declared, her chin lifting as if she had won some invisible battle. "Let's see how calm you are when they arrive." "I'll be just as calm," Malcolm replied, meeting her gaze evenly. "I hope you'll be able to say the same." Margaret smiled smugly. "Good," she said under her breath. "Now we'll see." Malcolm leaned back against the bench, his hands folded in his lap. His composure remained unshaken, but his eyes carried a weight of experience, a quiet understanding that this scene would unfold as many before it had. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the park, and the tension among the onlookers was palpable. A police cruiser pulled up near the park entrance, its lights flashing, but the siren quickly cut off. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel path as they surveyed the scene. The first, Officer Jenkins, was a tall man in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. His partner, Officer Ramirez, was a younger woman in her early 30s, her expression professional but curious as her eyes flicked between Margaret and Malcolm. Margaret immediately strode toward them, her dog barking in excitement. She waved them down as if she had summoned them to deal with some dire emergency. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "That man," she pointed toward Malcolm, who remained seated on the bench. "He's been here for hours, watching the playground and making everyone uncomfortable. He refuses to leave." Officer Jenkins glanced toward Malcolm, who sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap and his book resting on the bench beside him. "Has he done anything threatening or illegal?" Jenkins asked, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. Margaret hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the question. "Well, no, but he's just sitting there, staring. It's suspicious. He's out of place." Ramirez raised an eyebrow, exchanging a glance with Jenkins. "Sitting on a park bench isn't a crime, ma'am," Ramirez said evenly. "Did he approach anyone or act aggressively?" "No, but I know what I saw." Margaret snapped, her voice rising. People like him always pretend to be harmless until they're not. Jenkins held up a hand, cutting her off. We'll handle this, ma'am. Please step back. Margaret complied reluctantly, moving a few paces away but keeping her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on Malcolm. She muttered under her breath, but her words were lost in the murmurs of the crowd that had now fully gathered to watch. The officers approached Malcolm, who looked up at them with a calm expression. "Afternoon, officers," he said, his tone polite but neutral. "Afternoon," Jenkins replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We got a call about a disturbance. Mind telling us what's going on?" Malcolm gestured toward Margaret without looking at her. "I think the lady over there already gave you her version. As for me, I've been sitting here, reading my book and minding my business." Ramirez glanced down at the hardcover book on the bench and then back at Malcolm. "You haven't approached anyone or said anything to her or anyone else?" she asked. "Not a word," Malcolm said simply. "She came to me." Jenkins's gaze flicked to the small crowd forming around them, noticing the phones aimed their way. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" he asked. Malcolm nodded, reaching into his pocket slowly and pulling out his wallet. He handed over his ID along with a leather badge holder, which Jenkins took without a word. Ramirez stepped closer to Jenkins, peering at the badge. Her eyes widened slightly, and she whispered something to him. Jenkins's expression shifted subtly, his brows lifting as he glanced back at Malcolm, then at the badge in his hand. "Chief Hayes," Jenkins said after a pause, his tone softening. "You didn't mention that you're the chief of the police department." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The onlookers who had been quietly recording the scene now exchanged incredulous glances. A teenager in the back muttered, "Wait, what? He's the chief?" Margaret froze, her smug expression vanishing in an instant. Her face turned a deep shade of red as the words sank in. What did you say?" she stammered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Jenkins turned toward her, holding up the badge for emphasis. "This man is Chief Malcolm Hayes, ma'am, the head of our police department." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Around her, the crowd began to murmur louder, their whispers tinged with disbelief and amusement. A few stifled laughs broke the tension as people started piecing together what had just happened. Ramirez handed the badge back to Malcolm, her expression respectful. "Sorry for the trouble, Chief," she said. "We'll make sure this is resolved." Malcolm stood slowly, brushing off his jeans. He nodded at Ramirez and Jenkins, then turned to Margaret, who looked as though she wished the ground would swallow her whole. "Ma'am," Malcolm began, his tone measured and calm, "I hope this serves as a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous. You saw me sitting here, doing nothing wrong, and decided I didn't belong. That kind of thinking doesn't just harm me. It harms the whole community." Margaret's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the ground. Malcolm continued, his voice steady but firm. "We all have the right to exist in public spaces without being harassed or questioned. I hope this experience makes you think twice before judging someone based on their appearance." The crowd was silent now, Malcolm's words cutting through the tension like a blade. Margaret's face was pale, her earlier righteousness replaced with a mix of embarrassment and regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Jenkins stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "All right, folks, nothing more to see here. Let's give the chief his space and go back to enjoying the park." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many kept their phones raised, capturing the final moments of the scene. Malcolm turned to the officers, offering a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you for handling this professionally," he said. "Anytime, Chief," Jenkins replied. Ramirez gave him a faint smile as they turned back toward their patrol car. Malcolm gathered his things, preparing to leave. He paused briefly, glancing back at Margaret. Her eyes were still downcast, her hands fidgeting nervously. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something more, but he simply nodded to himself and walked away, his posture calm and unbothered. As he exited the park, the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, leaving Margaret standing alone, her face still flushed with humiliation. The silence Margaret had been clinging to was soon broken by the murmurs and laughter of the remaining parkgoers. Even as the crowd thinned, the reality of what had just unfolded refused to leave her mind. Her face was still hot, her hands trembling as she fumbled to leash her dog. Around her, snippets of conversations pierced through her swirling thoughts. Did you hear that? He's the chief of police. She called the cops on her own chief. Unreal. Classic Karen moment right there. Someone snickered. Margaret's chest tightened at the sound of the word Karen. It was the same name she'd laughed about on social media when watching videos of others acting in ways she now recognized in herself. But now, she wasn't a spectator. She was the story. Across the park, a teenager leaned against a tree, speaking animatedly into his phone. Nah, dude, I'm serious. She called the cops on the chief of police. I got it all on video. Wait till I upload this. It's gonna blow up. Margaret's stomach dropped. Her earlier confidence was replaced by an overwhelming dread. She glanced around, her eyes catching the lenses of smartphones that had been pointed her way. The realization hit her like a truck. This wasn't over. Not even close. Margaret hurriedly tugged her dog toward the nearest exit, avoiding eye contact with the few remaining parkgoers. As she walked, fragments of Malcolm's words echoed in her mind. Judging someone by their appearance harms the whole community. I hope this makes you think twice. Her grip on the leash tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, over and over, each time seeing more clearly how she had let her assumptions take control. Her determination to act, to feel righteous, now felt hollow, replaced by a gnawing sense of shame. By the time she reached her car, Margaret felt as though the entire park had been watching her. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before finally starting the ignition. As the car pulled out of the lot, she caught a glimpse of the bench where Malcolm had been sitting. It was empty now, but it felt like the weight of his presence remained. Within hours, the incident was all over social media. Videos recorded by parkgoers were uploaded with titles like, Karen calls the cops on her police chief. Harmony Park confrontation goes viral. Lesson in assumptions. Watch how Chief Malcolm handles this. Each clip showed the confrontation in stark detail. Margaret's escalating accusations, Malcolm's calm responses, the arrival of the officers, and the final, jaw-dropping reveal of his identity. The comments were relentless. She really thought she was doing something. Chief Hayes is a legend. Handled that like a boss. This is what happens when people act on stereotypes. She's gonna regret this for the rest of her life. Margaret's name wasn't in the videos, but it didn't take long for her identity to come out. Neighbors and acquaintances recognized her face and shared it across platforms. Margaret's phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. Friends and family texted her, some expressing disbelief, others offering support or criticism. Even her neighbors, once friendly and chatty, now avoided her. When she ventured outside, the usual warm greetings were replaced by awkward silences and sidelong glances. At the grocery store, a woman whispered something to her husband as Margaret walked by, her face burning under their stares. For the first time, Margaret truly understood what it felt like to be judged. The very thing she had inflicted on Malcolm now weighed heavily on her, and there was no escaping it. That night, Margaret sat in her darkened living room, scrolling through the videos of the incident. Her face on screen made her cringe. The way her voice rose, the way she pointed, the smugness in her tone. It was unbearable to watch. Her mind drifted back to the moments after the officers revealed Malcolm's identity. His calm, measured words had pierced through her anger and embarrassment. At the time, she had barely processed them, but now they played on a loop in her head. We all have the right to exist in public spaces without being harassed or questioned. Judging someone by their appearance doesn't just harm them. It harms us all. Tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time, Margaret began to see herself clearly, not as a protector of the community, as she had believed, but as someone who had acted out of fear and prejudice. She had assumed the worst about Malcolm simply because he didn't fit into her narrow view of who belonged. I was wrong, she whispered to herself. I was so wrong. The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She stared at the police department's website, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, with a deep breath, she began typing an email. Dear Chief Hayes, I'm writing to apologize for my actions yesterday at Harmony Park. The words were difficult to find, but Margaret pushed through, pouring her remorse into the email. She admitted her assumptions, her mistake, and the harm she had caused. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she knew she had to take responsibility. When she hit send, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. It wasn't enough to undo what she had done, but it was a start. As she sat there, she opened a search engine and typed, "How to address implicit bias." The journey ahead would be long, but Margaret was determined to take it. She had learned the hard way that growth starts with acknowledging your faults, and she was ready to begin. 2 days later, Margaret stood outside the local police department, her heart pounding as she stared at the glass doors. Her reflection looked back at her, tired, anxious, and unsure. Clutching her purse tightly, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. The receptionist greeted her with a polite but wary smile, clearly recognizing her. "You're here to see Chief Hayes, correct?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She had called the day before to request a meeting, and to her surprise, Malcolm had agreed. The receptionist gestured toward a small conference room. "He's waiting for you in there." Margaret's legs felt heavy as she walked down the hallway. When she reached the door, she paused, taking another deep breath before opening it. Inside, Malcolm sat at a simple wooden table, a folder and notepad in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but unreadable. "Miss Bennett," he said, standing to greet her. He extended a hand, and she hesitated for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm but not intimidating. "Chief Hayes," she replied, her voice shaky. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Please, have a seat," Malcolm said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Margaret sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she began. I wanted to apologize, Chief Hayes, for what happened at the park, for how I treated you. I was wrong." Malcolm's gaze remained steady, giving her space to continue. "I made assumptions about you," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I let my fear and bias take over, and I acted out of ignorance. I accused you of things you didn't do, and I embarrassed myself, and you, in front of everyone. I'm so sorry." Malcolm leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the table. "I appreciate you coming here to say that, Miss Bennett. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Margaret swallowed hard, her tears threatening to spill over. "I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I was protecting people, but I see now that I was just judging you. I let my own prejudice cloud my judgment, and I hurt you because of it." Malcolm's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "You're right. Your assumptions were harmful, and they didn't just hurt me. They sent a message to everyone in that park, especially the kids watching, about how we treat people who look different from us." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know. I see that now, and I don't want to be that person anymore. I've started looking into ways to educate myself, to address my own biases. I know I have a lot of work to do." Malcolm's gaze softened further as he considered her words. "We all carry biases, Ms. Bennett. What matters is how we confront them and whether we're willing to grow. What happened at the park was a teachable moment, not just for you, but for the community." Margaret looked up, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "You mean you don't hate me?" Malcolm shook his head. "Hate doesn't solve anything. What I want is for people to learn from situations like this, to see the harm that comes from acting on stereotypes. I've spent my career trying to bridge divides, not deepen them." Margaret's lips trembled as she nodded. "I want to be part of that. I want to do better." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "Then start by listening. Learn from the voices of people whose experiences are different from yours. Challenge your assumptions, even when it's uncomfortable. And when you see others acting out of ignorance or fear, don't stay silent." Margaret absorbed his words, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her, but now accompanied by a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thank you for giving me this chance. Malcolm stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Thank you for taking responsibility, he said, extending his hand once more. Growth is a process, but you're starting in the right place. Margaret shook his hand, her grip firmer this time. I won't forget this, she said, her voice steady. And I'll do everything I can to make things right. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began taking steps toward change. She signed up for workshops on implicit bias and diversity, immersing herself in perspectives she had never considered before. She volunteered at local community events, working alongside people from all walks of life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when her old habits resurfaced, and she had to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. But she was determined to do the work. At the same time, Malcolm used the incident as a platform to promote empathy and understanding. He spoke at community gatherings, sharing the story not to shame Margaret, but to highlight the importance of addressing bias and fostering inclusion. His words resonated, sparking conversations throughout the town. One afternoon, Margaret found herself back at Harmony Park, this time as a volunteer for a community cleanup event. She worked quietly alongside others, picking up litter and planting flowers. When a group of children ran past her, laughing and playing, she smiled, not with judgment, but with a sense of belonging. As the event wound down, she spotted Malcolm standing near the playground, talking to a group of parents. Gathering her courage, she walked over. "Chief Hayes," she said, her voice steady but respectful. Malcolm turned, offering her a small smile. "Miss Bennett," he said, "good to see you here." "Thanks to you," she replied. "I'm trying to be better." Malcolm nodded. "Keep at it. It's a journey, but it's worth it." As he walked away, Margaret felt a sense of closure. She wasn't the same person who had stood in this park weeks ago, accusing an innocent man. She was growing, changing, and for the first time, she felt hopeful about the future. Judgment, growth, and redemption. They're not easy, but they're necessary for a better world. Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of change and understanding.